Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé. My name is Elly Arrow. I'm in Germany. I'm an activist against sexual exploitation, and I have two brilliant women with me today, Andrea and Michelle.
Hi, my name is Andrea Heinz. I'm joining you from Edmonton, Alberta, where I spent 7 years in the licensed and commercial sex industry, and happy to be here again.
Hi, I'm Michelle Abel, and I'm coming to you from Pickering, Ontario, Canada, and I am a survivor of familial trafficking and an activist for human rights and child safety.
And if you're listening to this episode, this is a part 2. We did a part 1 where we talked about the language that we use for the sex industry or sexual exploitation or sex work, as some other people call it. And we gave some arguments in favor of terms or against others, and just explored a little bit where terms come from, the implications they have, how you can say one sentence about the exact same situation so differently depending on your choice of words. So we went over terms like prostitution, prostitute, also talked about slurs and slang terms, of which we know there are plenty. We talked about euphemisms. And today we're going to talk about the men in the equation, overwhelmingly men. The men who pay for prostitution, because the language there is really interesting. There's a lot to explore. It tells us a lot about our cultural attitude to what's going on. Before we start, I want to draw attention to a really interesting comment that we got on part 1, which if you're interested in this topic, you definitely should go back and listen. Yeah, we got a very interesting comment.
It was really interesting. So this was put onto our YouTube channel, and it was made by a woman who has the handle Yarnonymous, which I think is quite clever. And she says in both the knitting and crochet and plant communities, the term porn and whore are used. Women are calling themselves yarn whores and plant whores. And it makes me so angry as a survivor. I even heard a species of plant called a brothel because it attracts pests. Though I guess that is close to the truth. Brothels do attract pests.
All right. Yeah. Only the last year or so I started doing some knitting and crocheting, and it's actually really nice to get together, mostly meeting in like groups of women or mostly women. It's something that's so wholesome. This is what our ancestors did. They made their own clothes, or they fixed their own clothes. And it's cool to see how quickly you can learn to make like a shawl or a hat. It's a real art form too. And then for this pornographic weird language to come in, it's just very depressing. But like I said last time, porn has become almost synonymous with pleasure. And then whore just means you're enthusiastic about something, like you're whoring yourself out to the art.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I want to say first and foremost, hats off to you, because knitting and crocheting is totally a dying art. And I think especially among younger generations, we just don't see it happening anymore. So I think it's very cool that you're doing that. And same to Yarnonymous. And it kind of goes back to like what we were saying in the last episode about like food porn as well too. So it's like nothing is immune from it. Now it's, porn being connected to the knitting and crochet community. Like this is the most peaceful, kind place that you can imagine, probably, of like sweet women, like you said, sitting around and knitting and having nice conversations. And now it's like been infiltrated by this language again of whore and derogatory things like that. Like, why does it have to happen to everything? I just don't understand it.
You take something so interesting and common at one point, or something that I picture my grandmother doing this and knitting, and then you just make it ugly by putting this word whore into it. And so again, we just see how everything just becomes sexualized in society.
Can you imagine your grandma calling herself a yarn whore? Like,
No.
my grandmother would never have done
I
that.
can't. That's what I said. Like, I feel like I'm stumbling just even picturing that. Or, my dear mother-in-law, who loved to knit, by the way, and knitted so many different pieces for everyone that had babies in our family. And just to think that they would be considered yarn whores just has this really bizarre feeling in my mind.
Also, this woman, self-identified as a survivor. So, like, imagine what that's like for her, right? Is finding
Right.
like some part of community and connection with people and trying to probably do something that is, quite far removed from commercial sex, I would imagine. And then there's that infiltration of it. Again, it's like, it just shows that we can't get away from it no matter where we go and what we do as women. It's seeped into our culture.
I just have to complain briefly that I cannot catch a break. When I start new Netflix shows, somehow they all end up having content about porn or prostitution. Even though I tried to watch like wholesome things, just take a complete break. I'm watching Korean soap operas, which tend to be not very explicit. I'm watching them because there's not overt sex or rape scenes, because I'm sick of that. Or I at least, I want to be prepared if that's coming up. And in American shows, they just hit you with that right away. And I'm like, I'm starting all these shows and still, like, it's just everywhere. It's like, people ask me, like, why are you always talking about this issue? It's like, because I can't catch a break. And every time I see it, when I want to rest, it's there again. So it's so deep in the fabric of our culture that a lot of people don't even raise an eyebrow anymore. It's just a casual, fun word. But at the same time, we know it's still hurled at us as an insult. It hasn't lost that potency. That's the irony, the bitter irony, right? But let's move into the terms for today. We want to talk about the men. And I'll say this again. Yes, we know there are female sex buyers, but it is exceedingly rare. Most people who look into this, research this, monitor this, agree on this. So if we generalize and say men, that's just a reflection of reality. I might come back to that later, because I'll mention a few things about gendered languages, because I'm from Germany. German is a gendered language. So because if I say a word for someone who pays for prostitution, I'm indicating their sex. So we'll touch on that again later. Okay, let's get into some terms for the men who put their money in this industry, the reason that the industry exists, right? The prostitution and the porn industry. So the first term we have that we see everywhere all the time is the term client.
Grown.
Yes.
I think that might be my most hated term, honestly, because it is so, I don't know, it's right up there with sex work, sex worker. It's so cemented now. Like, we can't even say, any of these other terms, sex buyer, John, anything. They've been legitimatized as clients. I never see sex buyers referred to anything really other than a client anymore. Like, it's just what they're called now, and it boils my blood.
They love that because it sounds like, well, you're the client of a lawyer or of a house agent, or like, it's like even more than customer. Like, customer is already pretty euphemistic, but that's like, if I hear customer, I'm picturing someone with a shopping cart. And like,
Yes.
Women in the supermarket, like women in the shelves, like, I know that imagery is sometimes used in trying to show people how dehumanizing it is. But client, that's like, I'm taking up my client to a dinner. Like, it has that kind of ring.
It has a more personal connection tied to it. Like, customer has a more of a cold vibe, like you said. Like, it's the customer at the grocery store, but the client is like, oh, this is my, I don't know, personal training client or my therapy client, like someone that you have seemingly developed a deeper connection with.
Yeah. And that you chose as like a self-employed person.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you, as a banker, we had to use that term clients. And so for the most part, my clients were in suits or, business wear. So it gives them this kind of refined look and imagery that's used when you say client, because it's like you said, Elly, you think about, oh, it's a client of a lawyer, or in this situation, I'm telling you, they're clients of the bank. And so they represent, or they have this kind of very polished persona, but we know the flip side to that, right? So it's really interesting. Really, really interesting on the play of words.
And there's a term that connects. Tell me if people use that in English. In German, the brothel owners, or even women in brothels, they like to use the term guest, which has all these other connotations of like a leisurely stay. And a guest is also, I have guests in my home. Like if I'm, if I don't know, if I have a dinner party or a card game evening, you know, I have guests in my apartment. Guest is actually almost like a beautiful word, because that implies like it's sociable and you're being generous and relaxed. And yeah, I can see why a lot of the brothel websites in Germany refer to the men who frequent them as guests.
I've never heard that over here, but it has a very welcoming vibe to it, where it's like you've been invited, right? You're the guest. And I think that that's just maybe another sign that it's a vocal minority who are appearingly, or perhaps maybe actually are, fully autonomous in this activity, that are putting their language in place, and it's dominating the entire conversation, entire spectrum of agency and victimization that women experience. So like I've never heard somebody say a guest. I've heard patron and client and customer, but guest is a whole nother level.
Yeah. And it implies this kind of intimate relationship of your person, because think about it, like you said, when we invite people to our homes or to parties or anything that is a celebration of some sort, they are your invited guests. But most of the time we know these people, or we have an intimate relationship on some level with them, and so it's personal.
Yeah, we actually want them to be there. They actually are welcome. Right? Whereas you can call a John a guest, but you're probably still not genuinely wanting him there.
You're not wanted.
No, his money, but
right. So yeah, I hope I explained that properly. But I'm finding that I'm just picturing all these. I have all these images going through my mind right now with these terms.
Exactly. It's the mental image they paint. That's the point. Yeah. They paint like professional and almost homely images. Yes. And also I was thinking patron, don't you say like patron of the arts? So if I'm saying patron of a brothel, that's like perverse. Like I'm a patron of an art gallery or something. Like I know that a lot of these men like to style themselves as almost like connoisseurs. So it plays into that self-image. So some people, they find the best restaurant in town, and whenever they're traveling, they find the best restaurants, and they look through all the review sites to find the best restaurants or the best fashion stores, like whatever. And some men are like, yeah, I do that with brothels. That would lead us to the term hobbyist. This is a self-description, right?
Oh, this is another one that drives me mad. Pooner and hobbyist. Those are the two terms that the Johns use on our escort review boards in Canada. You won't ever even really much see them referring to themselves as clients, which is quite interesting. But they all, for the most part, call themselves hobbyists. Like that is the tag for their group to self-identify under. And I'm like, what kind of hobby is this for you people? Like, how does that become something that you categorize in that fashion? Like, a hobby is, I don't know. I got to look up the actual definition while we're having this conversation, because it just, I don't know. It doesn't seem to fit.
Crocheting is a hobby. Plants are a hobby. Drawing is a hobby. Sports are a hobby. Picking women off a menu by their skin color and their weight and their hairstyle, whatever, that is not a hobby.
Absolutely.
I mean, so here's the definition. It says an activity done regularly in one's leisure time for pleasure. So,
wow.
I mean, I guess if we're going off of formal definitions of a dictionary, it does fit, but it's another way to just kind of water it down. That you're making this like consumption and exploitation of women something that you do in your leisure time for pleasure. Like, I don't know, a hobby. Yeah. It doesn't fit. Even though it does fit, it doesn't fit.
Also doesn't square with their favorite argument that this is a need. This is a basic need like water and air and food and shelter.
Yeah.
But it's also a hobby. I'm sorry, which one is it? Is your life saved? Or are you a connoisseur of women? Some like Don
Juan.
Yeah. Like,
and pooner. Poon is a derogatory term for a woman's vagina. So a pooner, I guess, is a frequenter of that. I don't know if there's any dictionary definition of that. I would hope not. I mean, if that's in the dictionary, we've really lost the plot here.
That term pooner just throws my stomach into knots.
Thankfully, I don't think I've seen that used in any government documents, but it would not surprise me if that's coming down the pipeline in Canada pretty soon, right? Yeah. Where they'd say, like, these men, these clients, self-identifying as pooners and hobbyists, tell us in our research that, like, yes. that's coming, because let's be serious, it's Canada, and we are so neoliberal and have been captured so deeply by sex work ideology that it's coming.
What sounds very similar, you can get confused, is gooner, which is what porn addicts call themselves when they're proud of their addiction and they fetishize their own addiction. And you should, if you're interested in this topic, as dark and gross as it is, Roxy Roots, who is one of the hosts of this podcast and a survivor of the porn industry, she talks about this a lot, like how men get lost in a spiral of their own addiction and come to romanticize the addiction rather than be like, I'm barely functioning, I'm spending all my money and my time on like cam sites and that sort of thing. I'll just eroticize being lost in this and paint it in glitter, and then it'll be a good thing, and I'll probably call myself that. At this stage, we're talking about men who don't even really have respect for themselves anymore, which is very scary.
Yeah, because Coomer is like, you know, a more general term just for a porn consumer.
But then, slur. Like you said, Gooner is a self-description, and Coomer, I'm happy to say, has become a slur. That's like the only slur really on our list of terms, are like almost the only slur.
But it's interesting because so many of these terms too, people try to take them back and reclaim them. So you have to wonder how much of, you know, that Coomer label was impacting men and maybe causing them to have some self-reflection and introspection and be like, and then, like you said, they save themselves by, I choose this is a good thing, it's my identity. It's very similar to that on the supply side, right? To then like fetishize that and try to own it, so to speak.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
I wanted to mention one more term that is a bit ambivalent, and I didn't understand its full implications since I'm not a native speaker, and apparently it's also not used in all English-speaking countries, and that's the term punter, which I thought was just a synonym for customer, but it's not. It has these other connotations. In my notes, it says, punter has associations with risky financial traders, and it implies someone, or can imply someone unsophisticated or easy to fleece. But I don't know where that came from, because that was the first time when we were planning for this episode, that was the first time I heard about those connotations. I had no idea.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to find the root of a lot of these words and how they come about, but then also how they develop into other meanings of them.
Right. It's certainly not a term that we use over here, right, Andrea?
Yeah.
It's on the other side of the pond, as they would say.
Yeah.
But...
Someone from the UK, please send us a comment explaining like what the implications of punter are, because we all of us don't know.
Yeah, what I read was saying that it started off as just a general term. So maybe it's kind of similar to like client, where sex buyers wanted to have what would be considered this generalized term to make what they're doing seem normal and general and accepted. That's my guess.
Yeah.
But we do have some other terms that are clearly not very nice. One is the term curb crawler, and that refers to a man who's in the context of street prostitution, and he's crawling down the street in his car. So driving his car slowly and, looking at the women. Maybe the woman comes to the window, states her pricing or whatever. But as communities who have proximity to street prostitution can attest, like street prostitution is horrific enough, and then it spills out into the community, and they're crawling, just any woman walking down the street, or even they're crawling girls coming home from school.
I actually kind of like the term curb crawler, and I don't know much about it, but it just gives me this like creepy vibe about some guy like on his hands and knees, like, actually crawling. And I'm like, oh, it's lowly and like you're broken and you're, I don't know, like an insect, like a bug almost or something. It just gives me a bad vibe whenever I hear it. And I actually like that. So I'm all for the term, knowing that I know very little about the etymology of it.
Like now that we're talking about it, I'm picturing like an insect, like a weird spider or something.
I know. Yeah. Right? See, that was like the first thing I thought. Like you're just like, ugh, stomp on it.
Yeah. And there's another term, and I think this might be more common in the US. Well, so we have the phrase turning a trick. So that is having a man come and do sex acts. That's the most neutral way I can phrase that, and then pay for it or pay before. That is called turning a trick. And then the man himself can also be called a trick. So that is clearly not positive. I don't think any man would want to be called a trick.
I find it really interesting how that one is used almost closely universally between the buyer and seller, like men and women. Because men will call women in prostitution tricks, right? They'll be like, stay away from those tricks. They're no good for you. And then the women will call the sex buyers tricks. And I always thought it was more so a term for men because it was the woman tricking him into thinking that she actually likes him and, therefore tricks him out of his money. But I don't like that understanding of it if that's accurate in history, because it basically says that, the woman is again the one driving these interactions, that it's her fault, that, she's a deviant in some kind of way or duping him in some kind of way, which, I mean, yes, she is, because again, she's selling that lie. But it's interesting to me that the men also call the women tricks. Like, what are they? I'm tricking her into giving me sex by using this money. Like, is that how they see the women, as tricks? I assume so.
And I've heard a survivor say, we call the men this because they're tricking us. Yeah. So it also goes the other way.
The other way. Yeah.
So Andrea, you took some time to look into the term John, or the female equivalent would be Jane, and how that came about. And I should note, a lot of people get very confused when I say John, because I do use that sometimes. That's just stuck in my vocabulary. Like, what do you mean, John? My friend John? Men called John? This is offensive. I am confused. What are you doing?
Yeah, I tried to do some digging into it, and there's like literally nothing out there to find. I looked in like academic papers trying to find, earlier writings about the term or anything, and I literally found nothing. But what most people were saying online when discussing the term was that they assumed that in English-speaking countries, it was just a very, very common name, kind of like Smith or Jones, right? For a last name. Like if you want to be super generic, you'd be like John Smith. So I think that, it's hard to tell whether or not it was intentional or if it was just done subconsciously, because it was like, quick, think of a fake name. And that is a very common name. It always has been. It's a biblical name, so did people do it just subconsciously, or was it kind of done intentionally? Like, I will choose to call myself John because of like John Doe being anonymous by nature. Like, it's really hard to kind of tell why it came about, but it definitely took hold. But what's interesting about that is that Johns don't like to be called Johns. So, they were seemingly, from what it seems like, calling themselves John, and they did it so often that it became synonymous with a sex buyer. And
that makes sense.
And I can say that, I can say that too. Like, when I was in prostitution, literally about 90% of the men that paid me for sex were John, Dave, Steve, Mike, and sometimes Chris. Like, those were literally like the 5 names. It was just, and none of those guys really usually had that name. Over time, many of them would tell me their actual name, and it wasn't those things. But I would say, well, why'd you use that? And they're like, I don't know. It was just the first name I thought of. So I think that that's what happens is it's just it was and still is such a common name that men just defaulted to that. And it just became synonymous with them as sex buyers. And then Jane, I don't know. There's nothing, again, out there to find about that. And I think that that's maybe just somebody recognizing that there was a name for the men that was so synonymous with buying, but that there wasn't for women. So it was kind of like, well, we got to think of something, and maybe went back then to that Jane Doe, John Doe type thing. Because I don't know any women that, well, thankfully I don't know any women that buy sex. But we do know that there are some women that do sex tourism, right? They go over to impoverished nations and exploit men there. But do we know that they're giving the name Jane all the time? Like, I don't think they are, but maybe somebody could prove us wrong on that. So it's weird. It's weird how these names come about, but I think it was just that for John.
It's interesting because even as a child growing up and during my exploitation and my abuse, it's a word that I was very familiar with, John. And so even some of the people that may have been known to me, it was like they wanted that name John to be used, or I'm your John, so it's really weird how that came about, but it's definitely a name that has stuck. One of my abusers, his name started with a J, and so I think maybe it was used as an arousal thing for him to be referred to as a John. I'm not sure, but it's just interesting that the different experiences. And so for my experience to be told to just, oh, you could call me a John, or just call me John.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was so dismissive, as the act was actually happening.
Well, and we do know that some men do eroticize the exploitation itself, right? So that doesn't surprise me that one of them would actually want to be called like a Trick or a John or something, because then it does give him that vibe. But I think the majority are of the opposite, where they want to believe it's authentic and all that kind of stuff. But there's definitely that portion of them.
Yeah.
I have actually in online forums seen the so-called hobbyists, so the high frequency buyers, or whatever you want to call them, unironically call themselves whoremongers or whorerams. And that's really just an insult to the women.
Yeah.
It's an ugly word, but it just directs most of the viciousness at the women. And the men. What is a monger? Like a ranger? What I actually don't know what that is. Anybody know what a monger is?
I'm gonna Google it. I was gonna say, I thought it had a bad term. Like, whenever you think of monger, it's almost like a pest or a nuisance. Or
But even if I say someone who pesters whores, I'm still insulting the women more. Like, whore is worse than pest, and pest is pretty bad already.
Yes, yeah. A dealer or a trader in a specified commodity. A person who promotes a specified activity, situation, or feeling, especially one that is undesirable.
And I have the act or practice of promoting, spreading, or trading in a specific thing.
That is like street language for like sex work connoisseur, whoremonger, right? It's the same thing.
What's interesting too is it's talking about like dealing and trading, and hobbyists. Like, I think one weird flex that they always try to lean on is how they trade information. Like, they've got the intel. Yes. They've taken one for the team. They know all the ins and outs. So it's like a way for them to climb within that community. So yeah, it's but you're right, like attaching whore to it. I mean, it shifts that weight over back to the woman, which all these terms ultimately usually do, right?
So before we go on to the terms that we think are better, if not optimal, because optimal words we're still looking, I want to tell you about the most common German term for a man who uses a brothel or escort or the street. And we call them Freier, which means a suitor, and specifically a suitor for marriage. And so Freier, when I hear that, it conjures up a knight riding to a tower, and there's a beautiful princess in the tower, and he says, "My fair lady, I have been seeking right? I've been seeking true love throughout the lands, and I'm asking your father for your hand. That's what that means. And just the bitter, evil irony that is what we call the men who go to brothels, who all go there, almost all of them, for the exact opposite of marriage, for the minimum commitment to the woman, meaning just money, nothing else.
Honestly, like your culture, it shocks me every day, honestly. Like, I'm like, how is Germany still doing these things in 2024?
Yes.
Like, the stuff that comes out of there, like, I don't know how you survive there, Ellie, and I'm sure that it's very beautiful in many ways. I've seen lovely pictures of castles,
Yes,
but
we have
like
all the castles. I
Yes.
swear.
but the sex culture is just so far gone. Like, you guys are just on another level, and yeah, to appropriate such terms like that, like, I mean, there's still, I think, to some degree, problematic connotations to doing all these like hyper chivalrous type things, you know, where women are saved
Yes.
and all that kind of stuff. But then to, like you said, link that to someone who's actually not saving her in any way and is actually like further entrenching her into the depths of despair and trauma and harm, to put those two things together, like, we're just doing everything that we can as a society to absolve men of the reality of what they're doing, of that being noticed and of them being held accountable for it.
And so, unfortunately, the term Freier or suitor is so entrenched that I use it all the time when I speak to German people because it's the one most universally understood.
And isn't that so problematic too? Like, we're almost forced to use this language so that people can understand even what we're talking about, because it's just taken a hold so much that we can't even use like the progressive language or the balanced language even.
Yeah.
And there's another aspect to this. I think I mentioned earlier, German is a gendered language. So Freier is the male form and female would be Freierin. And I never use that because I don't have to, because it's just so rare that I mean, if it happens, I did do a few posts on female sex tourists to, I think, the Caribbean and parts of Africa. So I might use it maybe there. But the funny thing is there's this trend that we do in Germany that is supposed to be inclusive, but also in this instance, in my opinion, is getting abused. And that is people are meshing the female and male version together to try to refer to both at the same time and not use the generic masculine plural.
Inclusivity.
Exactly. And so the pro-prostitution lobby, I checked on their website, not all of them, but one of the biggest German pro-prostitution lobby groups always genders the word. And when I say gender, I mean it's always using the we also mean women. Women are included. Let me emphasize, women are included. And this might make sense if I'm saying, well, a doctor can be female, you know, male-dominated professions, a scientist. Then sometimes I myself might, you know, want to emphasize it's male scientists and female scientists, or maybe even use the mashup occasionally. There are situations where it might make sense. But in this case, we're including women to sanitize it. Because if women do it too, it can't be that bad. It can't be patriarchy, it can't be misogyny. And so I just get so offended every time I see them using that version of the word. So, yeah.
Rightly so.
Yeah.
But then closing thoughts on Freier, which ironically also some people who are just still learning German get confused because frei means free. So they're like, why is the word free in there? This is like the opposite of free. But this is like a little elaborate, but you can reframe the word in your mind because actually there are historic and folklore versions where the suitor in marriage is predatory. And the story that I think of is the story of Odysseus' wife, I believe she's called Penelope, who is waiting for him, right? He went to war in Troy and he's with his men and they're journeying for years and years trying to get back home. And she's there, a queen without her king. And all these men want to marry her. And they're in her halls and they're drinking all her wine and eating all the food from the store, saying, Penelope, marry me. I'll be king. I'll make a good husband. And she's always trying to find excuses to say, no, I won't marry you. No, I'm still, I'm still waiting for my husband. Or she's finding excuses. I don't remember all the details of that Greek myth. So if we reframe those men as essentially beseeching a woman, then we're back where we should be, right? The men waiting in the brothel room, essentially beseeching the woman, and if she's feeling uneasy, trying to find an excuse without hurting their ego. Andrea, you and I talked about that in our safety episode, trying to always appease the man's ego. That's what Penelope does all day long with the suitors, with the Freya. So it's a little elaborate, but if I reframe that in my head, then the suitor isn't the knight in shining armor, he's a predator.
Right. Circling around, you have to fight them off. I don't know if it's tied in any way to it, but like Freya in Norse mythology, it also means the lady and is a goddess associated with love, beauty, fertility, and sex.
Yes.
So is that like tied to that? Is that like...
I have no idea. So that would be, where does the word free come from? Or you mean the term Freyan?
Yeah, like Freyan with Freya as a...
Oh, I would have to research that. I don't know if I can Google that quickly enough.
I mean, I don't speak German, so like I don't know if you're saying it, ties or it evolved from the word free, then it might not be, right? But I just thought, oh, as you said it just made me think of that, that goddess. Like I was like, oh, isn't that the goddess of like sex and fertility and love and all these things is Freya? So
way back when, the people who lived in what's today Germany did also worship those gods. So I mean, these could all be related. It's still there in our language, even if in everyday we're not thinking about it.
Well, and I think too, terms have a geopolitical nature to them as well, right? So like what may have come about in one region because of something specific might actually be different in another area. And it's always hard to kind of trace back to like those very, very initial creation points on a lot of stuff, right? So it's, I think, just an educated guess at best for a lot of these things, because obviously we weren't living in these times back then. Like we weren't there to bear witness to it and kind of see the unfolding.
So free is derived from the Indo-European adjective for peaceful, loved, and kind.
Interesting.
We gotta get a language episode or a language expert on here.
I just really quickly, I want to look up the verb freien, from which Freya derives. It says it can also just mean marriage, to get married. Old Saxon for to love and to appreciate. So the opposite of what men do when they go to brothels.
Yeah.
This is depressing.
We're not even done this episode. We're already depressed.
Okay, let's leave the etymology to the experts. And if any expert is listening, is like, you got it all wrong, let me tell you. Please reach out or come on as a guest and let's explore. We'd love to.
These are just our thoughts.
So let's move into some words that we, as people who think the sex industry, prostitution, porn, is harmful to society, and society should fight to shrink it and help people who are in it survive through other means. What are terms that we would use for this group of men that we think is, if not great language, better language?
Yeah, I think there's a couple options for that. Seems like sex buyer is a pretty common one that a lot of abolitionists are using. And I think there's still some debate among that term too, because many of us, once we arrive at an abolitionist position, we don't actually believe that sex is what's being purchased,
right?
Because we believe that sex, operates on the understanding that it's freely given, it's reversible, it's informed, it's educated and enthusiastic, it's specific, and it really rests upon mutuality as the main foundation behind it. So when we say sex buyer, like, are these guys actually buying sex, or are they just buying, a woman acquiescing to them more than actually willfully agreeing to and engaging in healthy sex? And if it's not healthy sex, like what is it otherwise? Where I think then we have the other terms that come in too, like, paid rapist and stuff like that as well. If you believe, which I think we all do, that consent is not able to be purchased, and therefore it's not able to be sold in a prostitution exchange either.
What do you think, Michelle, about the term sex buyer? Because I also struggle with it, because it's not sex to me. Not really. So
no, I think it's the purchasing of women, and I think it has such a negative connotation to it. And you're not purchasing a service, you're purchasing us. and as a human being. So, and we're facilitating a need. And just because you throw money at a situation, it doesn't legitimize it, is what I'm going to say. And so to give it this term sex buyer, I just think that that's a really ugly term as a survivor.
Well, and then sometimes people say too, okay, well, let's call it buying sexual access. Like instead of buying sex, it's buying sexual access. But I think that also, in some ways it is good because it's talking about how he's only accessing her because he is paid for that. But it also does make it sound then like sex is something that men do to women. Like they access them to do that rather than, again, going back to that understanding of it being rooted in mutuality.
Yeah. But then we have the other part about when men are, inflicting this kind of behavior on minors, and where the minor or the child may not be paid. So, but they're still lumping them in the same category as a sex buyer, or calling a child, referring to that child as a child prostitute, which that's another term I hate, but it's the same kind of language barriers that come up for me, where I just think that, yeah, I it's not a term that I like. And I think, yeah, maybe for abolitionists it's an easier term for us to use, generally speaking. But then when you look at it as an overall term to describe what men are doing to women and girls, it's not appropriate. Because when you bring that into minors, and like I said, children, it's definitely the wrong term to
Yeah.
use.
Yes, exactly.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
No, it's true, because really you can't, in actuality, buy sex from a minor. You're paying to exploit that minor, or like you said, sometimes not even paying. You're just exploiting that minor. But what's your thoughts on what I said about like buying sexual access? Like, because I know some people, again, prefer that term because it's not saying that sex is what's happening. It's just accessing someone's sexual essence, I guess. But like I said, I have kind of a bad feeling about it because it makes women sound like the gatekeepers of sex.
Yeah, or like vessels or something. And
Yeah.
I have used that in the past, but not because I like it, but because I'm trying to be diplomatic. And the person I'm talking to, they will call it sex work. So I'm not using that. And I don't want to say sex buying. And so I'm saying sexual access, which that's kind of leaving it open. So to me, in the gap, I'm putting abuse, exploitation, violence.
Right.
But I am leaving the gate open for them to put in work, service. So it's like a negotiation. It's like trying to be diplomatic. But I have found people still get irritated. Like, what do you mean sexual access? Like, that's already too critical. So like they're already overwhelmed. That to them already has an accusatory undertone because I'm leaving it open to say sexual access that culminates in abuse. So I'm using that less now, and I actually find myself saying something that's very, very clunky, and I'm just saying men who pay for prostitution, men who pay to go to brothels. So what I like about that is I'm emphasizing that they're men, and they're normal men. We were talking about John Doe. It's your everyday Joe. So I feel like the men who pay, it could be anybody. That I like that it leaves that open. Doesn't fully capture how serious it is, though. And it's clunky. If I'm tweeting and I don't have space for men who pay for prostitution, I'm like, okay, I'll revert to sex buyer or just buyer. Sometimes I'm just taking sex out and just saying buyer. And then you can insert sex buyer, woman buyer, service buyer. You see, we're all struggling to find really good words. And if I could, I would say paying rapist. And some people in Germany have started saying that. It becomes a very, very long word in German. It's Bezahlvergewaltiger. So,
oh my gosh,
that's a mouthful. But I feel like that captures what it is, in my opinion. But people, they don't take it well. So that's only something the abolitionists might use between them, or some survivors might want to use that between them. When we speak to the public, we're back to sex buyer or the men who pay. So
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I do like that you say the men who what did you say, the men who purchase prostitution, or what was
pay
the
for
term?
prostitution,
Pay.
but insert
Okay.
purchase.
Yeah,
whatever.
that's actually really good. It is clunky and long, and I know what you mean. Like sometimes you have to almost give like an identifying / labeling term, like grammatically. But I think that using that, like you have been, is really good because it does talk about the action rather than the individual. So it's clearly stating what they are doing, who, and that really tells you who they are, right? Rather than saying sex buyer, right? It's like, well, what is that? Is that some guy that watches cam shows? Is that some guy that goes to strip clubs? Like men who pay for prostitution? It leaves no doubt in the mind. And I think it's very good because, again, it's an action term, which I think as much as we can use those, we should, but they're very difficult to use all the time.
Yeah. And I think sometimes I will just say purchasers, because that's very clear. I mean, you're purchasing us, right? And you're exploiting us. So sometimes when I'm lazy, or you're just writing notes or whatever, I'm comfortable with purchasers because that's very clear to me.
And are like people who view prostitution as work might get offended when we say buying women or purchasing women. They like to get offended. But, and I will repeat this probably a million times on this podcast, the biggest advertising site for prostitution in Germany is called Kauf mich, which means buy me. Does not mean buy my sexy time, my service, my sex work, my sexual experience, whatever. It says buy me. So the industry itself will, like in different points, admit that this is about buying women and then get offended when we call it what it is.
Well, and I think too, like I've tried to myself shy away from saying that as well, because people will always come back and be like, well, you're not buying my body, you're buying my time and my companionship. So I've started saying renting the bodies of women because really, they're not buying us as people. They're not, taking ownership of us, in a guardianship sense or anything like that, but they definitely are renting the bodies. And I think renting also has that sound of being used and then given back or discarded, right? It's like, yes, okay, these guys do take ownership in many ways because they suck the soul out of us and they carry it, and they're like energy vampires that consume us in many ways. But I like saying like men who rent women's bodies for sexual usage. And that's a term that but again, it's a long, clunky one. And I'm like, damn character count on Twitter. I can't work with this. I'm not paying Elon the $10.
Never. And I'll never say X either. Yeah. But I know that some women are like, they hear that and they're like, but I'm not a house. I'm not an apartment. I'm not a storage unit. And if you're saying I'm rentable, then you're almost affirming that I'm an object. And that's not our intention. But I can see how that can be misunderstood that way. So that's why I do sometimes say rent wombs when I'm talking about surrogacy. And like I said, all these industries themselves will say derogatory things about women that do conjure up her being an object, right? Both surrogacy and prostitution do that. Like, or sometimes trying to joke about, there's just a bun in the oven, or they say that about surrogates. She's just I don't want to go off on a tangent about surrogacy, but sometimes they say she's like an extreme babysitter. But then if I say her womb is being rented, this is exploitation, it's like, you can't say that. It's disrespectful. But extreme babysitter is not disrespectful to a pregnant woman literally making life with her body. Okay. But that's another topic.
Yeah. Or the term baby facilitator. Have you heard that?
For a surrogate mother?
A surrogate mother. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Baby facilitator.
She's not a facilitator. It wouldn't happen without her.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
So.
One that we should make sure that we quickly talk about is the whole sugar daddy, sugar baby, sugar mama type language that we're starting to see, which, I think we can all agree has a very incestual vibe to it. Like, I don't know what you guys think of when you hear that term, but, whenever I think of it, it goes back to reiterating how much incest vibes and themes have infiltrated into porn. Like, I swear, like, there's videos that you can see on porn sites that really, it's very obvious it's not incest, thank God. But it's like just the most random video, and they'll like tag it with like, stepdad does these things to stepdaughter, or it's like they put that on there because people are searching for that because they fetishize it so much. But it's obviously crossed over into the whole prostitution realm as well too, and maybe it was there before. I don't know the etymology again, but the whole sugar daddy, sugar baby thing, and sugar mama, consequently, all of them are just really super mad creepy to me.
Yeah, I hate these terms so much.
Me too. And I can add that, I know this firsthand in the Caribbean and South America, that incest is such a rampant problem. And the intergenerational trauma that we're seeing within families when you have, three victims, I'll call them, by one or two perpetrators in the home. And so I don't think it's just a fantasy or a fetish. This is normal behavior in some of our cultures. It's just still taboo for us to speak about it, but we definitely have to, educate people about it and bring light to these topics.
We don't want to talk about it, but we'll happily make it a porn category.
I was just going to say that. I was going to say, we won't talk about it in families or communities, but it is like probably right up there on the top search terms.
It wouldn't be as fetishized, I think, if we had real conversations about it. Because it remains in the dark, because it's forbidden, taboo, I think that aids. I do think there's an element there. Yeah, it's all the taboos that end up as the biggest fetishes. So rape, incestual rape, gang rape. And we might have mentioned this before, words paint mental images. And so when I hear sugar daddy and sugar baby, I think the so-called sugar dating websites, they want you, because it's the kind of images they use, they want you to picture this older man, but like, still fit. Silver fox is the term that you use colloquially. So just wealthy and single because he never settled down, or last marriage didn't work out, and then like a young sophisticated woman. But my brain paints a father and his toddler, or even younger, because baby, that's what's younger than a toddler? Yeah, a baby. So my brain, daddy and baby, to me are not sexual terms. It's a father and his child. And so to me, sugar daddy and sugar baby, because I'm seeing a dad and his child in my mind before, like, my brain corrects to, okay, this is a euphemism for a sex buyer and a woman in prostitution, in my opinion. In all our opinion, I think I can safely say.
Yeah,
it's always been deeply disturbing. And I don't understand why there aren't more people who have the same visceral reaction.
And I think it also speaks to that infiltration of that pedophilic tone of everything too. Like it, when you hear like a daddy and a baby, like you said, like one of the first things that you think in your mind really is that there's a power dynamic. There's a power differential, right? Like parent and child. Mm-hmm. And it so strongly gives that vibe that it's weird that people use it either unconsciously, or it's weird that they use it consciously, knowing that it's pedo adjacent. Right. Like, either way, it's creepy, and I don't think anyone should make a term out of it. But many websites have. It's now a full blown subset to the commercial sex industry, which really isn't any different than the commercial sex industry and prostitution at large. But we have just framed it differently that way. And so there's lots of websites, obviously, just for sugaring, where, both men and women don't want to admit that they're actually just involved in the prostitution system. So I won't name a whole bunch of them, but there is one website that really just boils my blood. And it's so obvious that it's exploitation. Like the name of this sugaring website is called What's Your Price?
Uh-huh.
Like that's the actual name of it. What's your
that's
price?
Just like Kauf mich, like buy me. That is the same.
Buy me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And so, as you can expect, people, mostly men, bid on dates with women. So it's like, okay, you want to take me out for dinner or spend time with me, which we all know oftentimes includes sex of some kind. But these men, or these sugar daddies, I guess maybe a sugar mama could be on there as well. I haven't signed up to the website to learn. I have no intention to. But, there's 5.1 million members on this website where people can basically bid on a date with a woman. So they've had over 56 million offers made on just this website alone. And the average offer for a date with a woman on this website is $126. So that's far beneath the going rate for traditional, named prostitution encounters, right?
This is Canadian dollars because because in euros.
I think it's American.
Oh,
I think it's American.
That would still be less than euros. I got to do that in my mind because that sounds like in euros that'd be a lot of money. But then, okay.
Yeah, I think it's American. I haven't looked at all of it super in depth, but I believe it's 126 American dollars. So roughly just under $200 Canadian.
But then if you're spending 3, 4, 5 hours with the guy per hour, that's not a lot.
Exactly. And 1 hour in Canada, bare minimum usually is about $200, bare minimum. So most women are making, on average in that $300 range, more so. Again, that depends on what region of Canada you're in and what your level of vulnerability is and things as well, right? But very alarming to have a website. What's your price? If we can't name things for what they are and we have to say, well, that's a sugaring website though, that's not prostitution. We've totally lost the plot. There's no hope.
We have a whole episode on our show about sugar dating, and I'll link it down below where other hosts go into that in depth. That whole deceptive marketing. That sometimes the marketing is so romanticizing, and then it's brutally honest with what's your price. So it's mind twisting. But I just wanted to mention before we move on that I hate how the term daddy has become so eroticized. It's just used by normal adults just to refer to their partner. I don't find a harmless I can find a wholesome explanation for calling your lover baby because you think they're cute and you want to protect them. And okay, we got sexy baby, which I don't know, baby has been used so long as an affectionate term for either sex. I don't think about it that much anymore, but there's no harmless version of daddy to me because I'm not saying you're loving me and protecting me. It's just always creepy. To say that to your lover, in my opinion, or for a man to be yeah, that turns me on. How would that turn you on? Have you been watching incest porn? How would that turn you on? And it just ties into the whole normalization of eroticizing submission, BDSM. Yeah, women should I don't know. I hear daddy as in the eroticized term, and I'm thinking a woman kneeling before a man. But then why would a daughter kneel in front of her father? That's it's weird and creepy, and there's a lot of things going wrong here.
Yeah, I think it's trying to be oh, this is protectionism, and this is taking a woman under your arm and caring for her like you would your child, or something like I agree. I think babe, I've been guilty of that.
Yeah.
Calling people I've dated in the past, even my husband now, babe, hey babe, can you grab that?
But it goes both ways.
I agree.
You're both babies to each other. So I feel that's different. If you're both calling each other baby, you're saying that's affectionate to me and protective. I can, you're not literally saying infant. Hey, infant.
Right.
So
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Right.
Oh God, hopefully we never get there here.
Hopefully. But here's something interesting I want to add. The Spanish term papi. And so in the Caribbean, and certainly some of my Venezuelan colleagues, they use that term as a friendly term, but it's also used as a sexualized or sexual term. It's just really interesting, the interchangeable ways in which we, may emphasize on certain terms as we make it relatable somehow to our relationships, right?
Well, and I think some people, you do see some guys be what up, ma?
Yeah, or
hey,
mommy.
mama.
Yeah, they'll say what's up, mommy?
Yeah,
so,
but that term kind of seems like it's more so just a way to acknowledge that she's a woman or a female, right? It doesn't have
And she's
necessarily
mature.
like they're not like,
and she's mature, and they have a level of playfulness and respect, right?
Yeah, like you don't really hear a lot of. I never had a guy call me like mommy during sex, but I had lots of men in prostitution be like, call me daddy. Like it was, the word was just fetishized of that. The guy that like, again, protects the women and, runs a ship and, runs a household kind of thing. It has that power dynamic to it that I think gives them a thrill.
Yes.
And I know we dunk on Germany a lot, and rightfully so, but I have never heard anybody say our equivalent would be Papi or Fati. I've never heard anyone say that in an erotic term, like never in an erotic context. Thankfully,
Right.
I mean, maybe I'm out of the loop. I don't know what the young people are saying. I think they're all saying daddy. I think they're also using the English words, though. But I've never heard the German word, so...
Interesting.
Well, that's one good thing.
Good thing, right?
We kind of shit on you a little bit earlier, so thank you for coming with something to offset that.
I'd like to bring up MAPS, but we don't want to really use acronyms or codified language. However, what MAPS means is minor attracted person. And this was successfully coined back in 2007 as a neologism by two online activists who had differing attractions to minors, so pedophilic and non-pedophilic. However, by 2023, following consistent use in academia, minor attracted persons had over 600 mentions in Google Scholar and had been used in state-funded research projects, and documentation, and even acknowledged in a parliamentary petition and law enforcement operations. Also, academics use virtuous pedophiles, non offending pedophile, or adult attracted minor in an effort to destigmatize pedophiles.
I didn't know it was that common already. That's terrifying.
It is.
Virtuous pedophile?
Can you imagine that term? Like when I came across that, I thought, what in the world is virtuous about being a pedophile? Like, this is the glamorization and the normalization that they're trying to bring about in society.
I think they're praising men for refraining from raping children. That's what they're doing. I mean, there's a whole debate if men are born that way, socialized that way, possibly a mix.
Possibly.
The point being, a man who does not offend, he's called virtuous. When I would just say that doesn't need praise. We don't praise non-rapists. We don't say, I don't know, my friend, he's not a rapist, by the way. Thumbs up. Like,
right.
I think it's tricky because in the psychology realm, there's an effort to destigmatize being attracted to a minor in their terms, because I think they want people who have not yet reached a stage of offending to feel like they can seek out, therapy and support from people. So like I did a school practicum for university at a halfway house, and it was basically filled with pedophiles. LTSO guys, we call them long-term supervision order people. So a lot of them also, some of them have gotten these like dangerous offender distinctions, really kind of the worst of the worst, like the people that are the fixated sex offenders that really there's very little hope for them to ever reform and rehabilitate, so to speak. And so I think like, I get the term virtuous pedophile because it's trying to say like, this is somebody who has that sickness, because that's what it is, to be attracted to a kid, but has not yet gone forth and made themselves an actual offender. But the problem with the virtuous pedophile and that distinction is that a lot of times, even if these men have not offended in physical form against a child, the vast majority of them still are very deeply set in pedophilic fantasies and do consume pornographic material.
Yeah.
And what we would find sometimes too is even if it wasn't actual child sexual abuse material or child pornography, as it's sometimes called, these men, when we would check their rooms at this facility, because we would have to, we would find like Sears catalog, ads of kids in swimsuits, or they would have movies. Like back then there were still VHS movies. I don't know how some of these guys had those, but it would be VHS films that would say like Star Wars on it. But then whenever you watch it, they would actually have re-recorded like a children's show off of cable TV. And it would have kids in a mock swim, setting with like a floaty pool or a blow up pool, like all that kind of stuff. So there's this sickness that goes beyond the actual offense. And I don't know what the right term would be, but I think it's dangerous when we try to say that even if you're having these fantasies and you're distorting what is normal content of a swimsuit ad for a child into something sexual, that's not virtuous in itself either. Like, how do we find that right term to acknowledge that, yes, they may not have offended and we want them to come forth for support, but we also can't give them praise, like you guys said, to have not, gone so far as to do those types of offenses against kids.
Right.
Yeah, so I think like for every man who might actually go out and seek help because he's been called a minor attracted person, there's like 20 guys who are happily offending on a spectrum, okay, but what you're saying is already concerning, who are not willing to cease the consuming that content, and worse, who are hiding behind it. So again, it's maybe not perfect language, because I can acknowledge that there's maybe a subset who will seek help and who need some encouragement. There's one term that I'm not sure who coined it, or I'd give them credit, but there's one that we use in the feminist community in Germany sometimes. And instead of pedophile, because that means love of children, we say pedocriminal. That does imply that that person has committed a crime. But you could also say like the attraction itself, like it's just trying to say this is not love and this is not neutral. This is inherently concerning. So I do like to use that, but usually when I'm using that, I am talking about somebody who has offended, who is definitely a criminal. So an offender against children. So
well, yes. and putting minor attracted person, like you said, it's a softening of a term that deserves to rightly have that stigma attached to it. Like these people, whether they offend or not, they meet the criteria, the DSM diagnostic of being considered a pedophile. So why can't we continue to call them pedophiles whether they offend or not? Like, why do we have to give them that softening of minor attracted persons? So like, it does come down to the weighing of it, because yes, for sure, there's probably been, like we just said, a couple people who felt more respected in that struggle to come forth and seek help before, they become a pedocriminal. But is it enough that it's offsetting that sanitization and that watering down of it?
And I also think that in sanitizing it, they're also trying for us to be more accepted or acceptable, so they want society to accept this term because, okay, fine, I understand the lessening of the stigmatization. However, the actual act or thought of the act to follow through is it's criminal in my mind.
Exactly.
So to me, you call the demon what it is, or the monster what it is. And if you're a pedophile and you're attracted to children, there's something very wrong about that. And yes, great for the men or women that come forward and seek help. But using terms for society to accept it or make it easier somehow for acceptability and to integrate it in academics, I don't think that this is the right approach.
Well, and I think too, like, we don't know how many people have pedophilic tendencies and deviances, right? And that's part of the problem too, is like, there's been some studies, and I wish I would have looked it up. I didn't even know we were going to touch on this topic to get the info. But I remember reading this study that had like this alarming number of people that basically said that they were attracted to children.
Australian study. We'll find it.
Yeah.
1 in 10 men, or
Yes.
it was
Yes.
yeah, like 10%, 12% of men or so. I don't know. Again, don't quote me, but it was alarming. It was like, holy shit. Like, so we're literally walking among these people, and, you know, it's undeniable that they're infiltrating academia, you know, institutions, all this kind of stuff. And that they are, if not pushing that agenda, they're not dissuading it from happening, because to them, it's kind of like, well, it sort of justifies how I see the world and who I consider myself to be too.
And I wanted to add about, you know, how it infiltrates our laws and parliament, and how this affects us as a society again, or as a whole. And as you're thinking, or people that are involved in writing laws, well, how do we balance this when you have the communities or the academia saying, you know, that, well, this is normal and this is acceptable, and yet here we are as women, as mothers, as survivors, we are trying our best to implement laws to safeguard our children and young people. So I just find that this kind of language makes it very difficult for us to do our job, and to convey the proper messages that we need to for government and policy work.
Yeah, and so I just want to emphasize for people, there aren't fully reliable statistics, but we know that there's a significant number of minors globally that are being sexually exploited, commercially sexually exploited. And many of them are still in the system when they're over 18. So they might age out of that. And then depending on the law in the country, the day they turn 18, they're a sex worker by the law. So there's a lot going on here. We often like to point at the pedophile. We think he's some antisocial person somewhere in a basement. Like we said, no, they walk among us. I mean, they're all throughout society. And we as society really contribute to the harm of children. So like Michelle said, age of consent laws were really fought for, right? They didn't drop from the sky. I don't know the exact history, but I know that the feminist movement was involved in that. So, for example, one of our abolitionist foremothers, Josephine Butler in the UK, one of the things she was talking about, depressingly something we still have to talk about because it's still such a big issue, like over 100 years ago, she was saying that there are all these adult men buying underage girls, access to their bodies, abusing these girls for money, and society isn't taking it serious because they're working class girls, right? Child labor was normal. So people, like a lot of children's rights, the right to go to school and not have to work, but also the right to not be sexually exploited, was really, really hard fought for and still needs to be defended. And I've probably said this before on the podcast, and I'll say it again. I don't know how it's not an international children's rights scandal. How recent the minimum age of 18 for prostitution is in many countries. Because in Germany, it was raised from 16 to 18 in 2008. And in Switzerland, it was raised from 16 to 18 in 2013. And those survivors didn't get any compensation. There's not a program out there where we say, wait, we had 16, 17-year-old teenage girls being raped for money in our brothels legally. We possibly taxed a lot of them. No apology, no fund, because those are, women now out there still struggling with that trauma. So yeah, we made it a crime. That crime has to be better hidden now. I don't think most people know how recent our child protection laws are. And sorry, one more depressive fact. The age of consent in Germany is 14. So if you're abusing a child without the commercial aspect, any offender of any age, when the child is 14 or older, it is possible to prosecute, but it becomes significantly harder because you have to prove that there was a power differential. And the German law does not hold that there's inherent power differential between someone who's 14 or 20 or 14 and 40 or whatever. Like I said, we like to point at the weird guys supposedly in basements, but the weird guys is our lawmakers, right?
Absolutely, Elly. And I'd like to speak into the age of consent here in Canada. Age of consent to sexual activity is 16 years. But you have the close in age exception. So a 14 or a 15-year-old can consent to sexual activity as long as the partner is less than 5 years older and there's no relationship of trust, authority, or dependency, or any other exploitation of the young person. So, therefore, that means if the partner is 5 years or older than the 14 or 15-year-old, any sexual activity is a criminal offense. However, there is also a close in age exception for 12 or 13-year-olds. A 12 or a 13-year-old can consent to sexual activity with a partner as long as the partner is less than 2 years older and there is no relationship of trust, authority, or dependency, or any other exploitation of that young person. But then we have to consider our Civil Marriage Act, which a person under 16 is prohibited from marrying. However, between the ages of 16 and 18 years of age in Canada, a judge can give written consent or in other circumstances set out the Marriage Act and the age of majority, which is also set out by our provinces or territories at 18 or 19. So minors under this age have additional restrictions.
And what does that mean? Additional restrictions? Like it should be like all restrictions. Like there's like we're gonna start marrying people younger than 16 and but
Yes.
with certain restrictions. Like I get why we have some of this stuff or why we've tried to frame it this way in Canada, because it's the understanding like, you know, okay, if you're I don't know, 16 and your boyfriend is 17, well, he will be 18 before you become 18. So, like, I get that they tried to do this close in age clause, but I think the 5-year one is very alarming. I think that really for anything to do with a minor, it should be more like 1 year or max 2. Because if not, then you've got literally a guy one day younger than 21 able to so-called get this 16-year-old girl to consent sexually to him. So like if that's not a power dynamic at 21 and 16, basically, like, you know, what is? Like, I don't know, it's strange. Nobody who's in early 20s should be dating anyone teenage years, I don't think. It just seems wrong.
Absolutely. And so we see in society that pimps and gangs can then exploit this loophole, right? And so a 19 or 20-year-old pimp can engage in consent to non exploitative sexual activity using the boyfriend method. But with a 14 or a 15-year-old girl, or they can send a 14-year-old gang prospect, which can legally engage in sexual luring of a 12-year-old girl and then pass her on to the older pimps to be exploited. So we're seeing this throughout our society.
Yeah, they don't seem to harmonize well with sexual exploitation laws and the effort to combat that.
Nope. And I also want to point this out. If you pay attention, there's been a lot of news articles recently. I'm glad they're reporting on this that are saying child on child sexual abuse is on the rise, and they do name porn as a factor. The thing is, it's not child on child, it's overwhelmingly boy on girl, but we don't want to name that. It's like that's gender wars. Don't you keep like that? It's like we're so uncomfortable, or we're immediately like politicizing it. I mean, it is political as in it's social, as in we can only solve it through, you know, organized effort, dedicated effort. But we can't say boy on girl. Just like people get very upset if we. Often you see these for adults too. You see these sentences where it says like woman abused 20 years in our marriage. Who did the abusing? Why can't you say man abused wife for 20 years? So we really don't like naming offenders. We don't like naming that it is overwhelmingly one sex doing it to the other, which doesn't invalidate when it's inverse or same sex, not at all. We just really like invisibilizing offenders linguistically.
Invisibilizing men, right? Because it comes back down to there being that gendered nature to a lot of sexual crimes and crimes of, intimate partner violence or interpersonal violence, it is typically predominantly men offending against women, or, children, younger men who are smaller or weaker. And, even just saying like male violence against women, you'll get shut down so quick by people versus if you advocate for violence against women awareness, then people are like, oh yeah, we're all for that. Like, nobody should harm women. But when you say, okay, I'm advocating against male violence against women. Oh, okay. Now you're anti-male, you're anti-equality. And it's like, we can't fix things if we can't have that initial honesty. And so much of that honesty is rooted in the language that we use.
There are also the men who are very set on, she should be over 18, but I want her to pretend she's not.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because that's only just kink, right? That's just role playing. There's nothing deviant about that in any kind of way, and perverse. Yeah.
So we'll probably dive into this some more in another episode. But Germany, I don't know if they're still advertising this way, but for a long time we had a pretty infamous brothel called the teeny brothel, because they just made an emphasis that the women were 18, 19. So like straight out of high school. And then obviously the high school skirt is just everywhere, right? Just imagine what that means for teenage girls. I wore a school uniform when I lived in Japan. We all wore shorts underneath our skirts, just in case the wind or a man or boy flips up your skirt. And I do know other girls that did happen, just men coming up behind them, flipping the skirt to try and see their underwear, or worse. Yeah, harmless fantasy, except it impacts our lives directly.
Can I just mention one thing as you say that? So the Catholic school board over here, that's been a real issue for girls wearing those skirts and then hiking them up. There's a standard length that they need to measure at. However, that's not what we see. And so I can say that there are actually groups of girls that will egg on, as they say, other girls or bully them sometimes to have their skirts shorter and to be accepted in their group. This is just another form of conditioning and grooming, I think, by their peers, because they willingly do it so that they can fit in. So I know this firsthand with family members and their children.
It's so disturbing. I mean, I remember being a teenager, and just having that awareness somewhere around 12, 13, 14, you start realizing there are adult men interested in me. And if I wear a dress or a skirt, that might be interpreted in a certain way. And you don't understand, if you're lucky to not have been abused, and then you don't fully understand what that means, and you have an inkling that it's disturbing, but you're also, then other parts of society suggest you kind of have a power, because like you can catch men's eye. Isn't that kind of thrilling? And then you are in puberty and you might start to be interested in boys if you're into boys. So maybe you do want to catch the eye of a boy in the same age, and you don't know how to communicate that other in the, like with the short skirts, like I really don't blame the girls. Like I understand where all that comes from. And it's just so frustrating that it's hard to have a culture where you could just flirt age appropriately. Like, these kind of like, there are harmless flirtations between kids that age where they like hold hands and like, this is my boyfriend, but it's nothing serious. It's just holding hands and like going to the movies. I wish it could be that harmless and you could just get to grow up in peace, but that's not the world we live in.
That's not our reality.
Yeah. Well, and porn has made the schoolgirl skirt so symbolic. In its own right of, as soon as you see that, it's like the same thing as like fishnet leggings or heels. Like it's right up there in those categories of like, when you see that, one of the first things that you think about is sex, rather than like, oh, this is a school uniform. Like that's probably a secondary thought maybe, but the first one is like, oh, this is a fetish outfit. And when I was in prostitution, like I can't tell you how many men asked me to dress in a schoolgirl skirt, and every time I was just like, oh, this is so gross. Like, why do I do this? Why do I wear this? And you don't understand at the time that you're feeding that beast within them too, right? You're just giving the creep what he wants so that you can get the money to pay your power bill. But it's hard because we don't want to say like, well, girls are at fault for wearing that because they're sexualized. Like that goes into that whole short skirt debate. But when schools are still allowing girls, some as young as preschool, like my daughter was 3 and I put her in a preschool, a private school, preschool, and they had uniforms for the kids, which I thought was super great. But one of the uniforms was this like short plaid schoolgirl, like a pleated skirt. And I was like, my kid will not wear that at 3. So I put her in the pants. I put her in the boys' uniform. Mm-hmm. But every Monday they had to wear the formal uniform. And for the girls, that was the skirt. And so I put leggings under her and, under her skirt. And it just always, I'd look around and think like these poor girls, like we're sexualizing them. And it shouldn't be that way. Yeah, 3. At 3. And it shouldn't be that way. Like we should be able to look at it and just be like, it's a girl in a skirt, it's cute. Yes. Like she's sweet. But because it's entrenched so deeply into that porn culture, and because porn culture is so entrenched into society at large, we can't separate it. So now it comes down to the question of like, do we not allow girls, not allow, that's not the right word, but do we remove the skirt as part of this like mandated outfit that they must wear? And it's just hard to find the right answer, right? Because we want women and girls to be able to dress how they feel comfortable, but oftentimes it's not in a schoolgirl skirt, even if they don't understand why they're feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky to solve without ending up blaming the girls or putting all the onus on them. And
exactly,
you can be in like sweatpants and get harassed and hoodie. We all know this.
Totally.
I just ask everyone, Google the word schoolgirl and then Google the word schoolboy. And you will see what the algorithm spits out. And I thought this was just a meme. I did it, and the schoolgirls, those will be overwhelmingly sexualized, and the schoolboys will be normal boys in normal outfits. And that concludes our discussion for today. If you're interested in hearing more about the subject of how to talk about sexual exploitation, our thoughts on different kinds of language, as we mentioned, there's a previous episode, and we promise there'll be another one. We also want to talk about the profiteers of the industry, mostly known as pimps. And this episode is in the pipeline, so it'll be coming fairly soon. And we hope you stick around to listen to that and many, many other issues connecting to the subject of sexual exploitation. We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.